There's no shortage of examples out there of games that rush to the finish line and, as a result, end up compromising on at least a few aspects of development. From content being cut to a general lack of polish to ideas not being executed the way they should have been to so much more, there's multiple ways that something like that can and does affect games. Things that perhaps could have been avoided if the developers had been afforded a little extra time to work on their project before launch. Here we're going to talk about a few such games that probably would have benefited from delays of a couple of years or so. Cyberpunk 2077. We'll start with what's become the poster child of rushed releases that could have benefited massively from a delay, or another delay in this case, because Cyberpunk 2077 was, of course, delayed more than a few times in the lead up to its launch. The state the game released in was, frankly, unacceptable. Not only in terms of the baffling lack of polish, but also the core gameplay itself feeling decidedly half-baked. With a couple more years in the oven, who knows, maybe things could have turned out differently. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. The Legend of Zelda series is no stranger to delays, but out of all of its mainline entries, the one that perhaps could have benefited from more time in development was The Wind Waker. The story is well known by this point, running out of development times with 2 entire dungeons cut from the game's final hours, replacing them with the now infamous Triforce quest. The Wind Waker is already a damn fine game. Just imagine what it could have been if it also had those 2 dungeons. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided had more than a few issues, from shoddy marketing to multiplayer being shoehorned into the experience and more. One of the game's biggest problems, however, was how it seemed to end so abruptly, right when it felt like the story was building up some momentum. In the time since the game came out, we've heard plenty about how that was down to development constraints, so we can't help but wonder what could have been if that hadn't been the case. Star Wars: The Force Unleashed 2. The original The Force Unleashed is very much a fan favorite, and in spite of the fact that it's decidedly rough around the edges, it has its fair share of fans. The Force Unleashed 2, on the other hand, was a bit of a disappointment to say the least. Large portions of the experience felt like they'd been cobbled together haphazardly at the last moment, without much thought being put in, which is something that more development time could perhaps have fixed. Homefront: The Revolution. Homefront: The Revolution's development cycle was an absolutely tortured one, with troubles at THQ throwing more than a few wrenches into the works over the course of several years. Obviously, with circumstances like that, it's hard to imagine anything other than a complete reset at an entirely different company doing much good for the game's development, though maybe additional time behind the scenes wouldn't have hurt things. Halo Infinite. Halo Infinite has been something of a string of disappointments in the time since its launch. In spite of the fact that both the campaign and the multiplayer received plenty of praise upon launch, the game's issues, though, clearly seem to be down to a lack of planning. The shooter's development wasn't the smoothest, but in order to push it out when they did, 343 Industries ended up not only sacrificing any semblance of a proper post-launch plan, they also decided to not ship the game with crucial features, such as a campaign co-op and Forge. With a year or so more in production, something like that maybe could have been avoided. Halo: The Master Chief Collection. 343 Industries clearly hadn't had great luck with Halo, especially when it comes to launching new titles in the series. In 2014, for instance, the franchise saw probably one of its worst launches ever with Halo: The Master Chief Collection. Saying that could have been avoided if the collection had been allowed to cook for another year or 2 before releasing is not even speculation, honestly. After all, that's how long it took for 343 Industries to turn things around for it. Now, the Master Chief Collection is a completely different beast and in massively better shape, so all's well that ends well, I suppose. Final Fantasy 15. This is kind of an obvious pick for a list such as this one. Final Fantasy XV's long and tortured development cycle is well known throughout the industry at this point, and the final product is reflective of the haphazard way in which the developer went about developing it. In an ideal world, Final Fantasy XV wouldn't be Final Fantasy XV at all, and Final Fantasy Versus 13 would have been allowed to be finished, but Final Fantasy XV getting more development time would have been a close second best case scenario. Mass Effect Andromeda. You can look at pretty much any BioWare game in history and talk about how it had a troubled development, but the last few years have seen those behind-the-scenes issues catching up with the studio, with the games themselves being affected. Mass Effect Andromeda is an unfortunate example of that. BioWare had ambitious plans for the game, most of which didn't come to fruition, while the game as it exists also had severe issues with polish. With more time in the oven, however, things might have turned out very differently. Anthem.
Hey!
Of course, right after Mass Effect Andromeda's failure, BioWare and EA suffered an even bigger one in the form of Anthem. The looter-shooter was in the works for a long time, and BioWare changed its vision for the game on more than one occasion. The end result was a hastily put-together game that wasn't quite good at any of the important stuff. More than added development time, Anthem needed a more cohesive and structured development timeline, but more development time surely wouldn't have hurt either. Assassin's Creed Unity. Of course, there's plenty of people out there who will argue that Unity is not a game without merits, and honestly, it's easy to see their point. Years on from launch, the game is in a significantly better state than it was when it first came out, which has allowed its inherent strengths to come to the forefront. Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Honestly, more than added development time, Ghost Recon Breakpoint needed better creative leadership, because this was a game that seemed hell-bent on cramming in gameplay mechanics that had no business being in a Ghost Recon title. But it had its fair share of core issues as well, like the terrible AI and the poor technical state the game launched in, that surely could have been ironed out if the game had indeed been afforded more time in production. Maybe then it would have been at least a marginally better product. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. Metal Gear Solid 5, in spite of its many issues, is easily one of the best playing stealth games ever made, which is why we can't help but wonder how much better it could have been if it had actually been allowed the development time that its development team and Hideo Kojima wanted it to have. There's no shortage of examples of ideas and chunks of content being cut out of the game due to time constraints, and seeing as that's one of the biggest criticisms levied against the Phantom Pain, it's no surprise that fans of the series frequently lament the fact that it had to be rushed out to release. Battlefield 2042. In the lead-up to launch, Battlefield 2042 was being touted as the ultimate Battlefield experience. It's fair to say that it fell way short of that billing, but with more time in the oven, things might have turned out differently. DICE made more than a few bad decisions with the game, and things were exacerbated further by the fact that the game's tight production timeline meant that even the questionable content it did have at launch wasn't without a litany of issues. Pokémon Sword and Shield. The Pokémon cycle is one that allows for no delays, since there are a lot of wheels turning constantly even beyond the world of video games when it comes to this property, but in a hypothetical dream scenario where Pokémon delays were indeed a possibility, Sword and Shield could have been made into much better games with additional development time. A lot of the game's best ideas were clearly not given enough time to breathe and ended up being incorporated into the game decidedly half-baked. That's all for now. If you enjoy what you saw, please hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, now is a great time to subscribe. We upload brand new videos every single day. After subscribing, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you next time, right here on Gaming Bolt.